We asked Dr. David Pinzon, Regulatory Affairs Manager at Corteva Agriscience. Let's look at agriculture from a historical view.
Agriculture is important to understand from a historical context, and I'm going to put some slides about this. The first one is that compared to 100 years ago, we have fewer farmers. And think about 100 years ago, the population was way lower, and we had more farmers back then. Right now, well, this is based on the stats in 2011, we have about 300,000 farmers compared to 3.2 million farmers. That means that most of us are not related to a farmer. Most of us don't know a farmer firsthand. So we don't know much more anymore how they operate, why they take some decisions. So we need to take a better effort to get to know them. And that's why, well, for example, in Alberta, there is something called Alberta Open Farm Days, which is can visit a farm and learn about that directly. I invite you to take any opportunity to meet a farmer, to talk with them, to ask them questions about why they do what they do it, and what's their motivation, so you get a better understanding of what goes behind the scenes. With less farmers, that means that the farms are bigger. So every farmer is responsible for managing bigger lands. And for that reason, they need better equipment, larger equipment to take care of those farms. And of course, every farmer now has a responsibility to feed more people. Approximately in Canada, 100 years ago, every farmer had to feed about 10 people. Now every farmer has to feed about 120 people. So that's a huge increment, and that's a huge responsibility that farmers have on their shoulders. With the added value that while every farmer needs to feed more people, the agricultural land is not increasing anymore. It kept increasing steadily until the 2000s, but it's not increasing anymore. So how can we feed more people with the same amount of land? Because as we know, the population keeps growing and growing, and at least not for the next 50 or 70 years, it's not going to slow down.
What happens before food hits the grocery store shelves?
So much needs to happen before you can have access to food. And there are some aspects that I think are really important. The first one is land. If there is not suitable land, there's nothing you can grow. And well, of course, there are other technologies such as hydroponics, but those are not, we don't have that technology there in place to be able to feed the world just with things like hydroponics. We need good quality seeds. If they have good seeds, that means they're going to be able to produce better plants. Genetics are really important. They need to control pests. If we don't control pests, that means we're going to waste a lot of food. Harvest is really important, and harvest is not always easy. Harvest, it can only happen up until a certain time. And if you get snow, then you're in trouble. If you don't get the conditions to harvest, then it becomes difficult. And once you harvest, then you need to find who is going to buy your product. And sometimes that happens even before harvesting. But there are some disruptions globally sometimes that don't allow farmers to sell their products the way that they were intended. Of course, weather is a huge issue for farming and for food production that they cannot control, but it's out there every single time. So you put all of these challenges together, and now we have an extra challenge. That challenge is one that didn't exist a few years ago, and that is public pressure. Public pressure has become so important that farmers have been forced to change how they grow food to adjust to that, which is always good. It's always good to evolve on the public needs and how farmers operate. But the important thing is that when we evolve, is with an understanding of the science, with an understanding of what is safe and what is not safe. And it's not just based on humans thinking that something is better or not.
What are some innovations in agriculture?
The same way that we need innovation, farmers need innovation too. And there is really amazing innovations coming up in agriculture. One of them is the use of satellites. So you probably know that tractors can now drive themselves through GPS technology. We have the ability to see the health of the crops with images that are taken every single day. There's so many innovations going on, but there are some very basic ones that have been evolving over the years. So the same way that humans need innovations and we have embraced those innovations, farmers need those innovations too. So here are a few examples. First one is cultivating the land. This is still happening, and this is still happens in some countries. The reason for that is because, well, maybe they have small parcels that it's not worth buying a tractor, or it's just not even accessible. Where I am from, Colombia, there are a lot of pieces of land that are just in hills, where you just cannot get a tractor in. So you may not be able to use that technology, but when you can, it makes farming a lot more efficient. And this is not new. For thousands of years, we have been evolving our way on how to cultivate the land, starting by hand, all the way until using very efficient equipment. Harvesting. I like to bring examples from my home country, Colombia. This is how they harvest potatoes in Colombia. So imagine how much of a disadvantage they are versus harvesting potatoes here in North America. So those innovations help farmers to get to the next level, help farmers to produce a lot more at a more affordable price for society. If labor was as expensive as it is in North America, these farmers in like food in Latin America would be very expensive for this specific example. And there is another important one. This is an image from some farmers in Africa controlling weeds by hand. Imagine doing this for the whole field. Imagine this position that these women have to be their whole day. It's absolutely hard on their body. In North America, we have the ability to use tractors and, well, many places of the world, but there are some places that still don't have access to these technologies, and pests do need to be controlled, otherwise crops are not going to thrive.
How can we increase the production of crops while protecting the environment?
At the end, there are two ways to make sure that we produce as much as possible in the same amount of land. The first one is nurturing the plant. So how do you nurture a plant? It's kind of the same way that you nurture any living thing. You need to give them food, which is fertilizers and irrigation, and you need to control those diseases, those things that could affect their health. So that's nurturing the plant. The second part is the genetics. So how can we improve those genetics to get to produce better crops? And this is not new for plants. We have improving genetics for dogs, for horses, for animals, for hundreds of thousands of years to get them to adapt to the environment and to the needs that we need.
How much land will we need to produce food without new technology and innovation?
I love this example that someone from Corteva Agriscience that came up with this graph, and I really like it. So this is how many acres, all of these points in green, is the area in the US that was used to grow corn in 2017. So 15 billion bushels of corn were produced in these green spots. These 15 billion bushels would be produced in all of this area in the US if we were producing at the levels of 1926. So to say this in other words, if the amount of corn produced by the corn plants and by the practices, agricultural practices, were the ones that we were using in 1926, it would take all of this land in the US to grow 15 billion bushels of corn. So of course that wouldn't be sustainable, that wouldn't be possible, and corn would be absolutely impossible in terms of price. So how was this achieved? It was achieved through genetics and through better management practices. So that's the combination of what I just told you, nurturing the plant and better genetics. And this has achieved with almost every crop that we grow.
Why do we need to control pests?
Why do we need to control pests? The reason is because we need to protect the plants. We need the plants to reach their full potential. And pesticides, as I said, is one of the tools that help plants to reach that potential. They're one of the integrated pest management tools, and it's not the only one, but it's one that is very important and that has been used successfully by farmers. Why do we need plants to reach their full potential? because when they reach their full potential, they're going to produce more of what we need to harvest. Maybe we're harvesting the roots, we're harvesting the stem, the leaves, the fruit, whatever thing we're harvesting, we need the plant to reach their full potential so we can harvest more in the same amount of land. And why is that important? Because we need to feed the world, and we need to feed it in a sustainable way. So if we don't need to use more land, then that makes it, that help us in that sense.
What is the difference between organic and synthetic pesticides?
So pesticides can be organic or synthetic. There's a common misconception that organic means that it doesn't use pesticide. No, it uses pesticide. It's just a different way to produce them. Organic pesticides are mainly sourced directly from nature, and synthetic pesticides are actually manufactured, but both of them, regardless that it's synthetic or organic, the safety profile is not defined by its origin. It's defined by the actual chemical compound and its hazard characteristics.
Let's talk pesticides.
Pesticides for agriculture in general, you can divide them into herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. Of course, herbicides control plants, fungicides control fungi, and insecticides control insects. So why do we need to control these pests? The first one, the most important, is maximize access to nutrients. If a plant can access nutrients, it's going to grow better. So I like this graph. It's about root systems of prairie plants, but it helps me to show my point about accessing to nutrients in the soil. So let's think that the plant that you're trying to grow is this one that I circle in blue. If you're trying to grow this plant and all the other plants are weeds, these weeds are competing for resources. These roots are just getting in the way of this blue plant that I want to grow. And even though the plant is growing, it's not growing to its full potential because it has competition. It's like anything in life. If there is competition for nutrients, they're still going to be able to grow, but they will not grow as well. So that's the first point, accessing at the root level. This is a picture that I took 2 years ago in one of our field trials. Before I joined Corteva, I had no idea what it means not applying a herbicide. I was like, well, I know herbicides are important to control weeds, but I didn't know how it looked like. This is how it looks like. This is a trial, and we have sections that are about 2 or 3 meters wide, where we have different treatments. The one in yellow is one that was treated. This one is not treated. So you can see how this wheat plant is growing nice, while here there are weeds all over the place. This is an image where you can see kind of up close the untreated section in yellow next to the treated one, where you see all these cleavers just getting on the way of these wheat plants. The wheat still gonna grow. You could harvest, but the grain is gonna be contaminated with the seeds of the weeds. The plants are not gonna grow as much grain, as good of a quality. So definitely important to control these weeds. And it's not that we're planting these weeds. These weeds are present because they disperse. They have a great ability to disperse across the fields. Another reason, think about coffee rust. And there is so many different rusts in so many different plants. When rust affects the leaves of a plant, it affects its ability to undergo photosynthesis. Because when all these cells are killed by the rust, then they're not functional anymore. They will not do photosynthesis. So the plant cannot make their own nutrients through the sunlight. There's another one, Sclerotinia in canola. So what Sclerotinia does, which is a fungi, it starts growing inside the stem until it creates these kind of rocks, and sclerotia. And what it does is it just disrupts the stem, and it disrupts its ability to transport nutrients across the plant. So these are just a few examples on how pests disrupt the ability of plants to grow efficiently. Sometimes they kill them, sometimes they don't, but the least they can do is affecting the ability of the plant to reach its full potential. some images here of insects, for example, so these aphids chewing from a corn plant, or some fungi that are disrupting these leaves and of course affecting the ability of the plant to undergo photosynthesis. And pesticides are not unique to agriculture. You probably have used pesticides at home. If you have a pet, you may have treated your dog for fleas with a shampoo. This shampoo has an insecticide. For humans, we don't call it a pesticide. It's regulated by Health Canada too, by a different division, but an antifungal cream is effectively controlling a pest. A fungi growing in your skin, it would be a pest. So,
why is growing my veggie garden at home different?
I'm going to use an example that I use for my 4th grade kids, but has been incredibly useful to understand why it's different to grow plants at home from growing plants in a farm. So when you grow plants at home for personal purposes, you have your home garden, you have your tomatoes that you're proud of, and sometimes you have too much of them that you have to get a lot of neighbors or family to give them away. When you're growing tomatoes for commercial purposes, it's completely different. You have a setting in which you have to maximize the access to sunlight, the access to the soil. And so you have completely different objectives. But when you grow plants in an agriculture setting, it's different. So we said that we manually get rid of those diseased tomatoes. So let's say that you would lose 10% of your tomatoes when you grow them at home. 10% of tomatoes when you grow them at home is just a handful of tomatoes. I think in general, we don't mind about it because we're not feeding the world. It's not our business. But when you're a farmer, and if you lose 10% of tomatoes, that could be millions, and that could make a difference in your profit and in feeding the world. So it's really important that we understand that even though we are able to grow food at home, we don't do it at the same efficiency as farmers do it to feed the world, to keep the prices low. So it's really important that you keep that in perspective. And of course, it's amazing that we're able to grow food at home, and in the summer we can feed ourselves, but we cannot grow every single item that we need. So we need to rely on farmers to do that. I took this picture last week in my local grocery store, and it didn't take me a lot of time to find these 2 tomatoes. And it's no brainer that most of the people are going to choose the tomato on the left and choose against the tomato on the right, even though the tomato on the right is completely safe. But because it has an imperfection, most of the people are not going to choose that one if they just have the ability to choose it. And they could eventually go to waste. So farmers need to produce as close as possible to perfection their food, so it's suitable for exportation, it's suitable for grocery store, it has a long shelf life. So that's why it's so important that the food that they produce is the best possible quality.
Can you explain the risks associated with pesticides?
In order to register a pesticide, and this is the second half of my presentation, which goes about the science supporting and how we ensure that pesticides are safe or can be used safely. So each pesticide must go through about 200 separate studies to support its registration. The way these studies are assessed is through a risk assessment. So what regulatory agencies do is taking all these studies together, all this information that is available, and understanding what it means, understanding the impact on humans, the environment, on animals, and understanding what that means in the context of the actual use of the product. This is not just a standalone, oh, what's the potential of this to cause this? No, it's what's the potential in the context of how the product is used. Why do I say that? Because every substance has the potential to be a poison. This is something that has been said for more than 500 years since Paracelsus came up with this. And all chemicals, regardless of source, synthetic, organic, are potentially toxic at some dose. Even water can be toxic. So regardless, it's not about if it's natural or if it's synthetic or the substance. It's about the chemical itself and its potential to cause harm. And any chemical, any substance has that potential to cause harm, but at a given amount. So what the regulatory agencies do is control the amount that we're exposed to it, so we can guarantee that on an acute and a chronic basis, we are protected. So what does it mean? It means that we take into account that potential and we assess the exposure. So PMRA decides this is an acceptable risk or an unacceptable risk. If it's an acceptable risk, then that means the product can be used safely. If it's an unacceptable risk, that means the product is not going to be registered, or maybe the use will not be registered. Let's say that we can control certain insect, but the rate has to be higher. If that higher rate is not acceptable, then even if it provides benefit, it will not be registered. So just put it in simple terms. Hazard is the potential to cause harm. Risk is the likelihood of harm in defined circumstances. Because I know this can be complex, and most of you may know about this already. I came up with this example. This is this polar bear, and the polar bear represents the hazard. Polar bears by themselves have certain hazard associated with it. The seal, they have an instinct and they know there is a hazard here, so they try to control their exposure. That's in nature. But when that's not possible, when they don't control their exposure, the risk is very high and then they can die. We all have been in a zoo probably, and when you're in a zoo, you are controlling your exposure. So even though the hazard is the same, because the hazard doesn't change, because your exposure is low, your risk is acceptable. So please notice that I never say that there is no risk, and PMRA will never say that. All I say is that the risk is acceptable. So that's very important to keep in mind. There is nothing that we can say that has no risk. Everything has a risk if there is high enough exposures. What happens if someone doesn't follow directions? So the exposure increases and then the risk increases. Luckily, farmers follow directions, they follow the label, and when they follow the label, they're ensuring that they're protecting themselves, they're protecting the environment, and they're protecting you. So everything we do in life, we're assessing risk. And it's not that we are assessing that kind of on a computational basis every time we do it. Like we just do it by instinct. But when you cross the street, when you take a decision to cross the street in the middle of the road or through the traffic light, you're assessing your risk and you are controlling your exposure by crossing through the traffic light. So your risk is acceptable. All right. So I'm bringing here an example of something that is natural, but a very small amounts could cause harm to infants. Honey is like doctors recommend not to give honey to infants 1 year old or less. The reason for that is because there could be a toxin called botulinum produced by a bacteria, and this toxin at amounts that are significantly small could affect an infant. So that's why it's just avoided. So we're just controlling our exposure. How do we control it here? We just avoid it. However, this same toxin called botulinum is a toxin that is found in something that is normally known as Botox. So this toxin at even lower amounts, at amounts that are so diluted, can be beneficial for medical purposes. So something that is toxic at certain amounts, at lower amounts can actually be beneficial. So again, it's not about the substance, it's about how much you're exposed to that substance. Of course, there are agencies that don't take into account risk, and this is one of them is the International Agency for Research in Cancer. They have classified some activities and compounds as possibly carcinogenic or probably carcinogenic or carcinogenic. So category 1 is the one that has been found, that has been proven to cause cancer in humans. But even for those compounds that are under category 1, we are still exposed to them. You can drink wine, you can be exposed to the sun. And as long as you control those exposures, you're going to be protected. Of course, there are exceptions, and there is some people that may be more susceptible to sunlight, and they may need to take further precautions. So for all the other categories, there is not a direct proof that they cause cancer in humans. That's why they're called possibly or probably carcinogenic. But in this classification, they're just taking into account the hazard, the potential to cause harm. They're not taking into account the actual amount that people are exposed to. So this is like the polar bear. This is the polar bear classification. It's based on hazard. It doesn't take into account risk.
Can you explain the regulatory assessment for pesticides?
At the end, the PMRA framework for risk assessment is designed to protect human health and the environment. That's the main focus of them, making sure that everyone is protected, and it will not be registered unless it has acceptable risk and provides value. So value is absolutely important as well, but value alone is not sufficient. It has to provide acceptable risk. So, and it comes back to that. So decisions are based on comprehensive body of open scientific literature and registered and supplied scientific evidence. Pesticides are reevaluated every 15 years or less to ensure that the science that was available at the time of registration is still valid. And if any OECD country decides to cancel a registration or amend a registration, Health Canada is in the obligation to review if the considerations that were taking place in that country have an impact in Canada, and if they need to take a similar decision. So when a risk assessment is conducted, from a human perspective, they take into account all the people that could be involved with that, with the application of the pesticide. So they take into account the farmers, the applicators, and they take into account the humans that are exposed to the food that could have traces of the pesticide. So as I said, it's the operator, bystander, the residential exposure, dietary exposure. So the studies that are used to support the registration need to help PMRA to determine what are the safe amounts that we can be exposed to on an acute and chronic basis. So acute means like, what would be the maximum amount that you could be exposed in a day that would not represent any acute harm? And also, what would be the amount that you could be exposed every single day of your life on, that's the chronic exposure, without causing any harm whatsoever. So PMRA does not take into account, it's not thinking, oh, what's the safe amount that can cause a migraine or something like that. No, it's absolutely an amount that will not cause any harm. So that's the amount that it's allowed to be used to use that pesticide. If the PMRA determines that maybe the pesticide can cause eye irritation when it's being sprayed, it's like, think about when you are using shampoo. If you open your eyes, it's going to cause eye irritation. So PMRA wants to protect the farmers, and if it can cause eye irritation, for example, they have to use safety glasses. If it can cause skin irritation, they have to use gloves. So the label requests certain protective equipment for the farmers, depending on the data that supports that registration. If PMRA considers that with using that equipment, it is safe for the applicators, then they can proceed with the registration. But it's not only the applicators, it's also the bystanders. So when you think about the public in general, they can be exposed from a residential perspective, dietary perspective, or drinking water. So we could be exposed from many different sources to the pesticides. So PMRA ensures that when the pesticides are used, the risk is acceptable. CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, ensures that residues in food are at the levels that are accepted. So,
what processes are in place to ensure the environment's safety?
So from an environmental perspective, it's a similar type of assessment. PMRA takes into account what happens with the product once in the environment, and what's the impact of this product on organisms. So they understand what happens in the soil, in the water, in the air, how long it takes to dissipate. They understand what happens with animals, and it needs to be demonstrated that the product will not cause adverse effects to sensitive non-target organisms. If that's demonstrated, then the product can be registered. The reality is that most of the product remains in the leaves. This is just a simple experiment to show. This is a paper that becomes yellow when water reaches it. So you see number 4, which is in the ground, is mostly blue because not much pesticide reach number 4. So most of the pesticide is going to remain in the leaves, but still the amount that remains in the soil needs to be understood what happened. And normally, regulatory agencies take into account a worst-case scenario, which is spraying the product directly in the soil, and to understand what happens with that. So they need to understand what happens when it goes in the soil, what happens if it reaches underground water, what happens if there is a rainfall event, a 1 in 100 years or 1 in 200 years rainfall event, what happens if that makes that it reaches the water, does it have any effect on aquatic organisms or not? So all of these are assessed by regulatory agencies to understand if the product can be used safely or not. So they understand that crops are not isolated environments. So knowing this, it has to be taken into account all of those components. And to assess that, PMRA takes, for example, they know how much pesticide would be on the diet, on the items from a diet from a bird. So birds eat insects, they eat grains, they eat plants. So PMRA would take a worst case scenario, which is spraying a pesticide and assessing what would be the amount of pesticide present in all those components of the diet, and if that would have a detrimental effect on the animals consuming that. Only if they're satisfied with that populations of those non-target organisms are unaffected, then the pesticide is approved. There is of course a space to mitigate risk. If there is risk to water, then they may establish a buffer zone. So sometimes there is a 10-meter buffer zone or 50-meter buffer zone to aquatic environments to protect aquatic organisms if they have an impact. If it's an insecticide that may have an impact on pollinators, then it cannot be sprayed before flowering or during flowering. So there is different recommendations, well, not recommendations, but instructions in the label that ensure that the pesticide can be used